Okay, I got the thumbs up. We're on live. So Edwina is a brilliant woman in her own right. She's a talented artist. She is an accomplished artist. Her work is all over the globe. It has been my mission to make her a household name in this country because she's a household name elsewhere. And you can find out more about her on her website at some point, but I can only tell you that I had great enough admiration for her to write her a letter some time back and to invite her to come out here, and maybe we could get one of her sculptures installed on Long Island, maybe even in the town of North Hempstead. And once again, I turned to our friend then, town supervisor John Kamen, and eventually we did acquire one of Edwina's sculptures called Tulips, and it is presently and has been for some time now at the Clark Gardens, available for anyone to visit, and especially in May when they plant all those tulips. It's really quite a beautiful piece and quite worth seeing. Having said that, I'm going to ask you for your, I'm going to ask you for your reaction to this film the first time and this time, if there's anything new that you've seen.
Well, hello, can you hear me? Good. First of all, Regina, my great friend and very generous person. So I'm very happy and thrilled that the Gold Coast Film Festival has become such a big success. And you too, I'm looking forward to having conversation with you. Louder, sorry. I don't think my machine's on.
No, it's working. You have to hold it up to your mouth.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Now, I don't always like to wear my spectacles, but on this occasion, I wanted to see your faces. So here goes. Anyway, one of the things about the film was, this is actually the second time I've seen it, and there's lots of new things that I noticed in it, and I'm looking forward to seeing it quite a few more times, because it's a film that keeps giving, I believe. There's so much in it, and that I loved, and it was quite touching, and I felt quite emotional, yes, and a little bit near to tears, which of course is not surprising, because my grandfather, Winston Churchill, he was never ashamed to let a tear fall down to show his emotion. Now, I was wondering if how many of you had actually heard, before you heard his speech now given by Gary Oldman, how many of you have actually heard his voice on radio? I'm not saying any of you are old enough to have actually heard during the war, because I think you look so young and beautiful here. But how many of you have actually heard his real voice on the radio? Yes. Well, that's one of the main wonderful things that he had. Apparently, words do count. So I've always thought that I was lucky to have Winston Churchill as my grandfather. And of course, he belonged to us as a family. But I do know, and I do know now, and particularly tonight, how he didn't just belong to us, our little family. He belonged to all of you, all of the people during the wartime, and all the people here who even are interested in him. So, and so many people, so many of you actually probably much more educated about him and know much more. So many Churchill buffs there are around the world. So he belongs to you as much as he does to me.
Edwina, you were a baby when this happened. Okay, now can you hear me? All right, I'm going to have to hold the microphone much closer as well. So you were a baby when this happened, but do you remember your grandfather or your grandmother talking about this, or your family talking about this period of time and the impact that it had on him and your family?
Well, I was a baby, and I do remember something that my nanny told me. because when we lived in London, in Chester Square, which was bombed during the beginning of the war, and my grandfather was Prime Minister, and he was at Chequers, the country house, where his official country house. And when he heard that we'd been bombed, and my father was away, and my mother, I don't know where she was, but they were all away. And so he sent an armored car to Chester Square to pick up me and my brother Julian. And Nanny tells me that the three of us went in the car, and we went to Chequers. And when we arrived, Grandpapa came out and saw us, and he said, "Poor little shelter brats." And that's I couldn't remember that actual thing, but Nanny never lied, so it must be true. So, well, it's hard to really say when you remember things exactly when they were, but I do know that Grandpapa, people thought of him as such a sort of in a way, fierce person, and he had to be fierce in many ways. But at home, he let us. I mean, the children were around. We had a wonderful time with him and my grandmother, and he didn't seem to mind. He always had a dog, and he loved animals, and children running around were no problem. And he brought his work to. Some men go out to the office and they don't bring their work home. Now, my grandfather, wherever he was, there were people working around with him, and if children were running in and out, and the dog, Rufus, jumping on his lap, and once at dinner, I remember on the dining table, the little budgerigar, the green budgerigar, Toby, he would jump onto Grandpapa's head, and everything was, it was strange in a way, I think, that we were not shooed away and told, go to the nursery. He didn't seem to mind the little children animals running around. So we did see him in a way as almost a normal family.
That sounds lovely. And how do you think that this movie, the portrayal of your grandfather, compares to some of the other films that have been made about this same period of time
Could I just tell them something that you told me? When the last time Edwina came out to speak, she came out when we screened The King's Speech. Were any of you there for that one?
Oh, yes, that was great.
Do you remember that? However, when I asked her, do you remember the actor who played Winston Churchill in that film? It was a smaller part. But when I asked you, and I said, what did you think of the actor? You said, oh, well, his voice was right, but my grandfather was much better looking. So what about Gary Oldman?
Well, I think Gary Oldman has been wonderful. I'm not sure if he's quite as good looking as my grandfather, but yes, he has portrayed Grandpapa very well, I think. And I think that one of the things he's brought out is the humor. You see, my grandfather had a good sense of humor and quite sometimes near the bone, cutting edge sometimes. He said some things that were quite, but if they were a bit sharp, perhaps in some ways to some people, but they were funny. So I think that the more direct a joke is, the funnier it's got to be to be put up with, as he would not say.
Was your family consulted in any way on this film or other films?
I'm not sure, but I was not. But but I'm very proud of it. I think it's very, very good, and
Accurate?
Well, I can't speak for total accuracy. I do understand that there's one scene that really didn't happen at all. By the way, I think some of the sayings that was said, they put it in what was said, that he took the English language and sent it into battle. I thought that Jack Kennedy had said that, but they put it in, but maybe it was said before, I don't know. So what did you ask me?
Oh, I was wondering if your family was consulted, but you
Oh, no.
mentioned that one of the scenes you don't think was
Oh,
actually-
yes.
Which one was it?
Yes, it was the scene in the London Underground.
Yeah, that's right.
Everybody said that that wasn't a real one, but maybe the spirit was there. The spirit was true. And it was very clever in the film.
I agree. Why did you think that this film was important to bring to the Gold Coast Film Festival, and how did you go about doing that? Because I
Okay.
know it was not very easy, I think.
Not very easy. This was not a film that needed our festival or any other festival. This was a film that already had buzz going from the moment the early rushes came out, with Gary Oldman in costume and completely inhabiting the personality of your grandfather. So for us, it was a struggle to see if could we get this film. And up to the very end, I finally called Edwina and I said, we're having trouble. We're talking to this one person over at the studio, and they really don't want us to have it before its general release. And she said to me, she said, well, darling, why don't you call him and tell him that I would be very disappointed? And we used exactly that phrase, and the very next day we got permission for the film. And
Thank you,
that's
Edwina.
the truth.
And what made this film stand out, besides your friendship with Edwina and obviously the historical importance of this film? But why so important to bring this film to the festival?
Well, we have a commitment to a lot of things at the festival. We like to have a diversity of topics, and we include history as one of them. And we have, generally every season, we have films that record some sort of if we're lucky, we get something with the quality that this film has. This film we already knew about. Our programmers are working all year. From the minute this festival ends, they're already looking at what's being shot, what's being developed, and starting the process. And we knew that this film was in production. So yeah, we thought, what a coup. I mean, so we've got it just shortly after its little preview screenings for some very elite people in the city. And people were quite surprised that we got it at all. So, ha!
I think it comes out right after Thanksgiving or right
Yeah, it's
before,
r-
right? Next week? In
Well,
films, I think so. In theaters, I think.
At this point, I really
Yeah,
don't care.
Doesn't matter. So one of the things that I think...
Here's one thing
Yeah.
they won't have. Every other audience that's going to
Right.
see this film will not have the benefit of Edwina sitting in the audience with them.
Could I say one more thing? Just when you asked that good question about was there anything that might not be true, I'm wondering, and I don't know yet, but I thought it was a fantastic scene, the king coming to visit my grandfather and sitting on the edge of the bed with him, having a really good heart-to-heart. And I wonder whether I hope it is true that the king decided to be completely brave and be prepared to stand up to the last. I thought that was a wonderful scene. I think we'll have to get some good historians onto that.
Can you talk about your grandmother?
No. Oh, that's okay. You're absolutely right.
Oh, my grandmother. My grandmother was wonderful. And of course, Clementine, yes, she was wonderful and she was beautiful. I think she was beautifully portrayed in this. I think my grandmother was just a touch more beautiful, but still, but pretty close. And her hair was exactly like that. We used to watch her sometimes when she would have her breakfast in bed, and then they loved their beds, you see. She'd have her breakfast in bed, and then we would go and say good morning to her, and sometimes she would have her hair in curlers then, and she would then go into the dressing room and take the curlers out, the rollers, they weren't quite rollers then, the curlers out, and then she would put her fingers in it and twirl it round, and she would keep those curls almost as if they were not. We would brush the hair out, but she kept them in those very, very sort of sculpted curls, which suited her very well. And, well, Grandmama was, this is what I want to say. Most men, or it's usually, used to be men ruling the world, so men were ruling the world, and they didn't always do well, but if they had the right wife, they could succeed. By the way, Margaret Thatcher had the right husband, so that was helpful to her. But Grandmama was the right wife for him, and if he had married the wrong wife, I think he wouldn't have got anywhere that he did, well, not nearly as far. So it's a little bit like, I feel, I don't know how many of you are keen on horses or anything, but horse jumping, you know, they go around the course, and the rider wants the horse to go as fast as possible over the jumps. Not over the jumps, but as fast as possible, because the timing is important. But just a few paces before the jump, the rider collects the horse, and they're only allowed to go like 1, 2, 3, and jump. So if they get it right, the rider, then the horse can do the best they can. And I think that having a little bit of control and help from a wife made the whole difference to the world.
I've heard marriage described in a lot of ways, but that's probably the best I've ever heard.
So your grandfather became an artist later in his life, or maybe throughout his life. He painted. You also became an artist later in your life. What kind of influence did his painting and his artistic endeavors have on you as a person and your artist?
Well, he was 40 when he started painting, and I was about 30, I think, when I decided to do it. He was the first artist I ever knew. We didn't come from a family of artists. That he just took it up out of the blue and decided to do it, and did it well with gusto. And he loved colors, and I love colors very much too. So I didn't really ever expect to be an artist, but when I did start, of course, I feel I have the love of colors that he had, and I love his paintings very much.
Did his work influence your work?
Well, not really, I don't think that much. More the fact that he decided to do it influenced it, because I don't really paint the way he painted, although I probably could.
I know you could.
There's still time.
Well, I have my own style, you know, and I'm sure he would have liked to paint like me if he could see them. I'm sorry, that's one of my regrets, that he didn't ever. Well, he did see. We always did Christmas cards and things and drawings for him, and sometimes he would give me a little advice, but he didn't really see me doing some things that I have done, and some of them he might have been a bit surprised at.
It seems like your family was very close, despite the public eye that it lived in, and also that you had a very loving family in many ways. What's your most cherished memory of your grandfather and your grandmother?
Can you repeat the question for them?
What's your most cherished memory of your grandfather and your grandmother, if you have one?
Or one of them. I'm sure
one
you
of
have
them. There's
bunches.
Yeah, many.
Well, I think really what I like remembering best is being at the dinner table, sometimes like Christmas, where Grandmama would be at one end and Grandpapa at the other, and they were, I think, most of the time, you know, in harmony, and she made everything perfect in the house. And we had quite wonderful family dinners, and often after dinner, Grandpapa would recite poetry till tears came to his eyes. Now, one of the things I remember him reciting was in the film tonight, when he recited how Horatius kept the bridge in the brave days of old. And that nearly brought tears to my eyes tonight. He loved Rudyard Kipling too.
Do we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, perhaps?
I just have a couple of things I want to share with the audience, which I don't know that they know. You once told me that I think when you went, this was your grandfather's funeral, and that was a revelation to you. Do you want to describe that scene? Do you remember what you told me? You came in from a different door, and when you were, the family came in through a different door, and it was all formal, and laid out in the public. That you were quite amazed.
Oh, yes. Well, yes, I think one of the after Grandpapa died, there was a lying in state. His coffin was in Westminster Hall, which is right next to Parliament. It's part of Parliament. And so I remember going with my sister and my little son, Mark. He was about 2 years old. And as we arrived at Parliament, there were queues and queues and queues and lines of people some of them had been waiting almost, 12 hours to go in, because the public were allowed to go in and stream past the coffin. And that was the most poignant moment. And then perhaps it was a mistake, because if we had to line up, in a way, that's a very emotional thing when you finally get into the hall and after waiting so long. But my sister and my son and myself, we were whisked in. We could go straight in, and so we got our place in the middle of the queue of people going round. And in a way, I think it was very emotional, but I think it was particularly emotional to see how the public was so emotional about it.
You must be very proud of your grandfather.
Well, everybody who loved him is proud of him.
The other thing I think the audience might want to know is that there is another prime minister out there who's a huge fan of Churchill, and whom Edwina met, and the first thing he did was show her that he keeps her grandfather's photograph on the desk on his shelf behind his desk. I shall tell the story? Okay. That prime minister is Benjamin Netanyahu. And Edwina, we went to Israel at the prime minister's invitation because Edwina has been invited to install a sculpture in Israel. And that is being worked on as we speak. But Prime Minister Netanyahu made it a point of sitting with Edwina. He couldn't get enough of her. And he told you stories, I think. You told me once, I think he knows more about my grandmother than I do. But a huge, huge Churchillian, if there is such a word. We can open it up to questions. You can do that?
Sure. Not too many, but maybe one or two questions if anyone in the audience has a question.
Oh, there's one way in the back.
You'll have to speak up.
It's a pleasure to meet you, and your smile just lights up the room, and I enjoyed the film tremendously. But I just wanted to say, just getting back from Cuba, they have a whole series of cigars there named Winston. And I'm wondering, did your grandfather smoke till all his life?
I'm just going to repeat. Did you all hear the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, yes. Grandpapa went to fight in Cuba very early on. I think it was on horses then. It was so far away. I think he had his, I don't know which birthday, like a 24th or something birthday there. He learned to smoke cigars in Cuba, and he thought that was great, so he never stopped. And I think he was never short of cigars, because the Cubans always gave him cigars.
Thank you.
Of course, I love the film, but we hear so much about Winston Churchill and his period as Prime Minister, but I really know nothing of his background before he became involved in politics, and what type of
Well,
I'm going
you
to-
have to read
We have to
the
repeat
book
the
called,
question. Wait,
well, what
wait.
was his background before he became interested in politics? Well, that's a subject too long for tonight, but I recommend you read a book, the easiest book. Anyone, even a child of 8 or 10 could read it, but also a woman of 80 or 90 could read it, and anyone in between. It's called My Early Life, and it's an absolutely charming book and great fun, and it tells all about his school days and how he tried to get into Sandhurst, the military college, and I think he failed twice, but the last time he had an exam, and it was geography, and so he hadn't done much work, and he didn't know what to study, so he put a pin on the map, and he didn't know what would come up, and New Zealand came up. And then it so turned up that when he opened the exam papers and saw the questions, they say, please tell us all you know about New Zealand. So he had spent one evening on New Zealand, and he knew it freshly. So there's a lot to know about his early life, which is partly why he had his later life. So please read My Early Life. It's a pleasure.
Last question? And
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's true or not, but he had such a mastery of the language, English language. He wrote so well. But then I heard that he had dyslexia, that he had difficulty reading, or he had, is that mistake? Is that
They're saying that he had a mastery of the English language, but then you heard that he had dyslexia as a child, or as so did the king, actually. I don't know if we didn't know the word dyslexia then, I don't think, but he did have he stuttered a bit, and he did go to a speech person, and he became a fantastic speaker. Maybe partly why he was such a very good speaker is because sometimes he paused. Maybe he paused. And the pauses, the pregnant pauses, they make it. And sometimes people just rattle on with what they're saying, and you don't have a chance to take it in. So he would pause after some fantastic phrase, and you would understand it. It's not like reading. When you read, you know, you take it in straight away. But when you hear a speech, sometimes you're on to the next sentence before you've even quite taken in the full impact of the one before.
I want you to join me in thanking Edwina for coming out.
And thank you all for being a wonderful audience and making me say things I hadn't even thought of saying.